I think it's so important that we recognize that oftentimes we look for light when we don't realize that we ourselves are the sun. And when I say that, I really mean in the sense that we constantly look for things outside of us. We constantly look for validation, for appreciation, for love, and for peace outside of us, when in reality, it's who we are. Those things can never truly be found externally because they only have meaning externally because we give them meaning internally. So when I say that, I really just mean to say that anything that you could ever want, every feeling that you could ever want to substantiate within your own life is something you could give to yourself right now. It's not necessarily required that we have a certain thing or we accomplish something before we feel the feelings of having or accomplishing said thing. And I think it's so important that we recognize that, because I think it's so important to understand that, desperation is a bad thing. That the people that need something the most have it the least, and the people that need something the least have it the most. So it's almost about recognizing that if you want to feel appreciated, if you want to feel validated, then it's about substantiating that feeling for yourself rather than looking for it outside of you. And then in turn, it's almost a spiral in the sense that once you feel it internally, then you'll just find more reasons to feel it externally. And then once you feel it more externally, it'll almost just give you more reasons to feel it internally, like a positive feedback loop. And I think it's so important that we recognize this, because so often we try to look for certain feelings, for certain emotions, and for certain experiences outside of us, when the only thing that we need is ourselves and God. We can't control anything outside of us, so why would you allow yourself to be emotionally based on the things that are happening to you rather than the things that you yourself are doing? You can fully control your thoughts and your emotions. You can feel anything at any point in time. It's not required that you see a certain thing or you sense a certain thing in order for you to feel it internally. And the simplest way to explain that is just in what we always do, in that we typically imagine bad things happening to us. We imagine a certain argument that didn't happen. We imagine a certain thing that we should have said to a past conversation when the past doesn't exist anymore and the future doesn't exist yet. So typically we substantiate negative emotions for ourselves through our imagination, but why don't we consciously decide to substantiate positivity and positive emotions? Why don't we allow ourselves to feel what we want to feel, to live how we want to live internally, which will in turn allow us to experience that externally? We look for so many emotions, so many feelings, so much validation and self-worth outside of us without realizing that you could give it to yourself right now. Like I said, you don't necessarily need a certain thing externally in order to feel and experience having it internally. Because at the end of the day, anything that you want externally is just what it is. It's neutral. It's not positive or negative. They only have meaning because we give them meaning ourselves. So why don't we substantiate that meaning for ourselves without necessarily being dependent on the things that are happening around us? The Bible says that we shouldn't focus on the things of this world, but rather be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And I think that's really what it means. That we shouldn't necessarily focus on the things that are happening outside of us, because that's not what's important. What's important is the meaning that we give to it. So why don't we substantiate that meaning? Why don't we transform ourselves internally, which will then in turn allow our world, the way that we experience the world, to change externally? And I just think it's so important that we recognize the amount of power that we have over our internals and the lack of control and the lack of power that we have externally. It's about recognizing that, you can't look for something outside of you. When the answer is inside of you, you'll never find it. Any search for value, any search for meaning that you're looking for externally is something that you could give to yourself internally. Because if you just close your eyes for a second and you imagine having everything that you ever want, you will feel that positivity despite the fact that it's not actually happening around you. And it's almost that once you allow yourself to feel that positivity and you go with that, then almost what you imagine will just naturally come to you. Because then it becomes a part of who you are. It's not something that you need to force yourself to conform to. It's something that you're just naturally flowing towards. So I just think it's so important that we recognize the amount of value and the amount of self-worth that we have as human beings. We're not dependent on the things that are happening around us, but rather the things that are happening around us are dependent on us. And I just think it's important that we recognize that. The Bible verse I have for this video is taken from Matthew 5, verse 14. And it says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden." So I just hope, this helped in some sort of way. Something I was understanding a lot more, especially today. Just that, I think oftentimes we tend to forget the amount of control that we have over our internals and the amount of value that we have as human beings. Because we look so much for the things that are happening outside of us when the whole time we should just be focused on what's happening inside of us. It was a quote that I saw, and it says that, the only thing that you need is you and God. Everything else is a blessing. And I just think it's so important that we recognize that, and the fact that even though everything else can be positive, everything else can be a blessing, the only thing that you need is yourself and God. And I also just think it's important that we recognize how important our emotions are. How what we feel is more important than what we know, because most of the time we act in accordance with what we feel and not necessarily what we know. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not to say that, you should, neglect your emotions, or that you should focus fully on, logic and reason, or that you should neglect logic and reason and focus solely on your emotion. But rather it's to say, what if we aligned our emotions with how we would act with logic and reason? Because then it's not something that you're clashing with yourself over. It's not an internal battle, because there is no battle. It's just two parts of the same whole working together in unison. So I hope you took something from this video, and thank you for watching.